Australia finds itself at the epicenter of one of the most complex geopolitical puzzles of our time. The country that once prided itself on automatic alignment with Washington now performs an intricate diplomatic dance, maintaining deep military ties with the United States while pursuing increasingly vital economic partnerships with China. This transformation didn't happen overnight, nor does it represent a fundamental betrayal of Western values. Instead, it reflects the sophisticated evolution of a middle power learning to navigate an increasingly multipolar world where economic survival and strategic security no longer point in the same direction. The catalyst for Australia's recalibration came not from Beijing, but from Washington itself. When Donald Trump returned to the presidency in 2025, his administration's America First tariff policies imposed 50% taxes on Australian steel and aluminum exports, treating one of America's most loyal allies like any other trading competitor. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's response captured the broader sentiment among U.S. allies. This is not how you treat a long-term friend. The economic reality hit hard, particularly affecting Australia's core export sectors of mining and agriculture, industries that have sustained the country's prosperity for decades. This economic pressure created an opening that China was quick to exploit. Within months of Trump's tariffs taking effect, Albanese embarked on a 6-day diplomatic mission to Beijing, the most extensive Australian prime ministerial visit to China in years. The trip wasn't about ideology or abandoning Western values. It was about economic survival. China represents approximately 25% of Australia's total bilateral trade, making it impossible to ignore regardless of political preferences. During the visit, both nations signed a memorandum of understanding and began discussions about revising their decade-old free trade agreement, demonstrating how economic pragmatism can override political tensions. The economic relationship between Australia and China tells a story of mutual dependence that transcends political rhetoric. Australia exports the raw materials that fuel China's industrial machine, iron ore that becomes steel for Chinese cities, coal that powers Chinese factories, and liquefied natural gas that heats Chinese homes. In return, Australia imports the manufactured goods that fill its stores and the electronic components that power its modern economy. This trade relationship survived even the significant tensions of 2022-2021. When China imposed retaliatory tariffs on Australian wine and beef following Australia's calls for a COVID-19 investigation. The economic pain from those measures convinced many Australian producers that political confrontation with their largest customer was a luxury they couldn't afford. Australia's military alliance structure presents a stark contrast to these economic realities. The AUKUS Treaty, signed in 1951, remains the cornerstone of Australian defence policy. This mutual defence agreement has seen Australia participate in every major U.S. military engagement since World War II. From Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan, the alliance reflects supposedly shared democratic values, cultural ties rooted in British colonial heritage, and strategic interests in maintaining regional stability. Unlike the economic relationship with China, which developed gradually over decades, the security relationship with America was forged in the crucible of global warfare and has remained remarkably consistent through changing governments and shifting international circumstances. The AUKUS partnership, announced in 2021, represents the most ambitious expansion of this military relationship in generations. The agreement commits Australia to purchasing at least 3 Virginia-class nuclear submarines from the United States, starting in the early 2030s, with a total program cost potentially exceeding $245 billion. Beyond submarines, a UK-US encompasses cooperation in artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, quantum computing, and hypersonic weapons. This technological dimension positions the partnership as a direct counter to China's military modernization in the Indo-Pacific, creating a fundamental tension with Australia's economic dependence on Chinese trade. The domestic political dimension of this balancing act reveals the complexity of modern Australian society. Opinion polling consistently shows strong public support for the U.S. alliance alongside pragmatic acceptance of economic ties with China. However, immediate concerns about housing affordability, healthcare access, and employment security create pressure for policies that prioritize economic stability over ideological positioning. The AUKUS agreement faces particular scrutiny during Australia's ongoing cost of living crisis. With critics questioning whether spending hundreds of billions on submarines that won't arrive for decades makes sense when hospitals lack funding and housing remains unaffordable for many young Australians. Australian public opinion doesn't see the country as challenging either China or the United States. Instead, there's a widespread understanding that the economy depends on China, while security depends on America. And most Australians want their government to manage both relationships effectively without forcing unnecessary choices. This pragmatic approach reflects a business culture that values economic success alongside a historical attachment to supposedly democratic values in Western institutions. The Taiwan question represents the most dangerous potential flashpoint in this delicate balance. When Trump administration officials pressed Albanese about Australian military support in a hypothetical Taiwan conflict, his response demonstrated the art of strategic ambiguity. Australia officially recognizes the One China policy and does not maintain formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Yet ANZ's obligations and AUKUS commitments suggest Australia would likely support U.S. military action, despite enormous economic costs. Albanese's refusal to commit to specific military actions in hypothetical scenarios reflects sophisticated diplomatic positioning that preserves flexibility. While avoiding provocative statements that might escalate tensions, the domestic conversation around AUKUS reveals deep divisions within Australian society. Academic experts and think tanks consistently argue that the submarine program represents poor value for money, questioning whether nuclear submarines will remain strategically relevant given rapid advances in drone technology, cyber warfare, and space-based capabilities. Opposition parties and civil society groups have launched campaigns for Australia to withdraw from AUKUS, arguing that it unnecessarily antagonizes regional neighbors and commits the country to military technologies that may prove obsolete by their delivery dates in the 2040s. Australia's response to these competing pressures involves positioning itself as a regional leader and mediator, rather than simply choosing sides between great powers. The country has dramatically increased investment in Pacific Island nations, recognizing China's growing influence through infrastructure projects and economic partnerships. Recent initiatives include $161 million in support to Southeast Asian countries and $300 million to the Asian Development Fund, representing Australia's counter-strategy to Chinese Belt and Road Initiative projects. The Indo-Pacific Endeavour program facilitates annual military exchanges with countries including Cambodia, Indonesia, East Timor, Vietnam, and the Philippines, building regional networks that provide alternatives to exclusive great power alignment. This regional engagement strategy reflects a broader recognition that Australia cannot simply rely on great power patronage for long-term security and prosperity. The Pacific Island nations, many facing existential threats from climate change, represent both a moral obligation and a strategic opportunity for Australian leadership. China's infrastructure investments in these countries during the previous decade exposed Australia's neglect of its own neighborhood, forcing a recalibration that prioritizes active engagement over passive assumption of influence. Australia's recognition of its vulnerable position has sparked efforts at economic diversification and supply chain resilience. Though geographical and economic realities limit these options, the government has identified critical minerals, renewable energy technology, and advanced manufacturing as areas for reduced Chinese dependence. However, alternative markets cannot fully replace Chinese demand in the short to medium term, particularly for the bulk commodities that form the backbone of Australian exports. The European Union represents one potential diversification target, particularly following Brexit and changing U.S. alliance dynamics. Recent dialogue between Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and the European Union to manage Trump administration policies suggests opportunities for strengthening ties with like-minded democracies. Yet even successful diversification cannot eliminate Australia's fundamental geographic reality. Proximity to Asia makes economic integration inevitable, regardless of political preferences or security concerns. Australia's current strategic dilemma echoes its World War II transition from British imperial protection to American alliance partnership. When Japanese expansion threatened Australia in 1941–42, the country shifted primary allegiance from London to Washington based on strategic necessity rather than sentimental attachment. This historical precedent suggests that Australia's current hedging strategy may represent preparation for another potential transition. though military alliance with China remains both politically impossible and strategically inadvisable, given fundamental differences in political systems and regional ambitions. The parallel with World War II reveals both opportunities and constraints in Australia's current position. Like the 1940s transition, current strategic pressures may force uncomfortable choices between traditional relationships and emerging realities. However, unlike the clear existential threat posed by Japanese expansion, today's challenges involve managing relationships with both superpowers rather than choosing definitively between them. This complexity requires diplomatic sophistication that exceeds even the wartime realignments of the previous century. The success of Australia's balancing act depends on several critical factors beyond its own control. The trajectory of U.S.-China relations will largely determine whether Australia can maintain dual relationships or will be forced to choose definitively between economic and security partnerships. Regional partnership building efforts may provide alternatives to exclusive great power dependence, but only if other middle powers prove willing to resist pressure for exclusive alignment. Domestically, the sustainability of expensive military commitments during economic uncertainty remains questionable, particularly if promised benefits fail to materialize within expected timeframes. Current indicators suggest three potential scenarios for Australia's future positioning. The most optimistic involves managed competition between the superpowers, allowing Australia to maintain its current balancing act through continued economic cooperation with China and military partnership. With the United States, this requires both superpowers to accept Australia's dual relationships and avoid forcing exclusive alignment choices, a proposition that becomes less likely as strategic competition intensifies. The second scenario involves forced alignment, where escalating U.S.-China tensions compel Australia to choose definitively between economic and military partnerships. Given alliance obligations, shared supposedly democratic values, and public opinion trends, this would likely favor the United States despite significant economic costs. The recent experience with Chinese retaliatory tariffs during the COVID-19 investigation period provides a preview of the economic pain such a choice might entail. The third scenario involves Australia leveraging middle power partnerships to create alternatives to exclusive great power dependence. This path requires successful regional coalition building and represents potentially the most sustainable long-term strategy, though it demands diplomatic skill and economic resources that may exceed Australia's individual capabilities. Rather than representing departure from Western alignment, Australia's diplomatic maneuvering suggests evolution toward more sophisticated and autonomous foreign policy positioning. This reflects recognition that 21st century geopolitics requires nuanced approaches that transcend Cold War binary thinking. The Australian case offers valuable lessons for other middle powers navigating great power competition. Economic interdependence creates space for diplomatic flexibility, but alliance obligations impose constraints on strategic autonomy. Success requires careful management of competing pressures while building alternative partnerships that provide strategic options. As the Indo-Pacific region becomes the primary theater of great power competition, Australia's experience balancing economic and security interests will likely influence similar decisions by other regional actors. The country's ability to maintain this complex equilibrium may determine whether the region experiences managed competition or dangerous polarization in the decades ahead. The stakes extend far beyond Australia itself, encompassing the broader question of whether middle powers can chart independent courses in an increasingly bipolar world, or whether they will be forced into exclusive camps that limit their sovereignty and economic opportunities. The challenge facing Australia reflects a broader transformation in international relations, where the neat alignments of the Cold War no longer capture the complexity of modern geopolitical relationships. Countries increasingly find their economic interests pulling in different directions from their security concerns, creating opportunities for diplomatic creativity, but also risks of strategic overextension. Australia's success or failure in managing these tensions will provide crucial insights into the possibilities and limitations of middle power diplomacy in the 21st century. What do you think? Leave your thoughts on comments. And don't forget, like the video and subscribe the channel to keep thinking the world how it really is.